It's funny. When I first started collecting, I got some very good advice from very, very good collectors here in LA who were kind of mentors. And one of the things they said was, collect in your generation, because that's who you're going to really understand the most. So what's happened as I've grown is that the art that I can really understand and speaks to me is, artists who are more in mid-career. So I love going to see the young artists and, seeing what's going on. But I have to be honest, like my eye isn't there because they're 20 years younger than me.
Welcome to the Artelligence Podcast. Live Art's look behind the scenes at how the global art market really works. I'm your host, Marion Maneker. This podcast is brought to you by Live Art, the global art marketplace that puts you in control. Download the Live Art app to get all of the most relevant art market information, as well as access to exclusive private sales. Or visit us at liveart.io. Sonya Roth has been a prominent Los Angeles collector for 2 decades. Originally a criminal prosecutor, she was an early champion of the current generation of emerging artists and collectors, and played an important role in the growth of LA's contemporary art scene. Since 2015, Roth has led Christie's Los Angeles office, which moved to an expanded Beverly Hills location 2 years later. Roth is now the managing director for Christie's Western U.S. region, leading the firm's growth strategy by focusing on client engagement and strategic business development. With Frieze Los Angeles opening today, we thought this would be a great time to hear more from her. The reason I wanted to talk to you, well, there are multiple reasons, but one of the big issues that I feel like is undercovered in the art world, though everyone seems to agree to it, is the signal importance of Los Angeles as an art center today.
Of course,
and you seem to me a person who has been, since the Big Bang. You've been doing this for 20 years.
Thanks for dating me, but yes, it's true.
and a big part of your job running Christie's in Los Angeles is to be very well connected to the collectors and the artists in town and get a sense of what's unique about the Los Angeles culture. And so,
sure.
I mean, maybe that's the best place to start. Is there something unique about Los Angeles in terms of the art world? And if so, can you describe it for us?
Sure. Los Angeles is certainly very unique and original, I would say. And even as you were saying, I was just listening, certainly for my job, it is a lot of, being connected to the different collectors and the art world out here. But the reality is I have this job because of the art world that was out here and being a part of it. There, like you said, about 20 years ago, I'd say, there was a real surgence of the arts here in LA. And it started out kind of slowly, and then it really snowballed and picked up. And it started really with the artists. The art schools were really, churning out great young artists, and they had space and a community in which to work. And I think that was very different from, say, other art centers like New York or London or, other parts of the world where, it wasn't easy to get space. It was very competitive, and maybe part of our laissez-faire attitude here in LA, it just really allowed this community to blossom, the artistic community. And it was different. And I think it was different because it was not answering to any kind of demand or commerciality at that point. It was really just, artists being very self-motivated and creating art. And that's always the best. And so I think what happened is as the artists proliferated, there were very, very few galleries, less than I can count on one hand. And it just, started this great interest, in arts. And of course, we've had, some very established, long-standing collectors, the Broads, and, for a very long time. But this art scene that you're talking about that we see today really began around that time. And the artists were doing really interesting things. And I think that was bringing a lot of attention from outside of Los Angeles, whether it was from collectors or other artists, institutions. And that's another point. At that time, the institutions really started to hunker down and blossom, and the programming and, just the communities just started to grow from there. And it really fed off each other. And the difference between, I think, the collectors that came around during that time period, which I, of course, am one of them, is that you felt really close to the art. And it was so much more than buying something that you thought was interesting and that people really liked to put on your walls. It was really having kind of a piece of your community and, this life that you were living. I just remember in the beginning spending, all our free time in artist studios and the galleries and seeing shows and, with the institutions. And it was a life, and it was a beautiful life, based on things that are really moving. Yeah. The best of it, right? That's really at the base why people should and do collect art. And so I think that spurred on a community here in LA that really got to experience that, and it is beautiful. And so they were really kind of collecting on that sense. And then, of course, as it grew, the number of artists grew, the number of galleries grew, the number of collectors grew, and we kind of found ourselves where we are here today. But I will say that I think that thread really still rings true with the collectors in LA. There is less of a look at the commerciality of it and more about, the artist practice.
The artists are more accessible in Los Angeles, or became accessible in a way that they certainly hadn't been in Los Angeles, and maybe not necessarily are in other cities at all. Yeah,
that's a very good point. It's very true. I think that one thing about the artists in LA is that they're at all the openings, regardless if it's their own or not. There is a wonderful community and a supportiveness in it, collaborative. And I just remember at the time, if I wanted to go see an artist that lived and worked in New York or London, I'd have to go through the gallery or whoever it is that was kind of dealing with them. Whereas here, it was really different. You could just call the artist, or, you'd see them out. They'd say, oh, you should come by and see the studio. I'd really love to show it to you. And it just felt a lot more accessible and personal.
And that's a driving force for a lot of collectors. We sort of talk about the art market, but we forget that for many collectors, having access to the artist, buying or collecting along with their career, collecting deep, as they say is one of the satisfactions of being a collector.
It is. It actually makes you vested in the artist. You really have that kind of connection. And then, to be a supporter of an artist from the time when they're, really starting out at the beginning of their career and carrying them through their mid-career and through, that's really very, very, it's a lot of satisfaction for a collector. To see the artists that they love grow.
And so you're also saying that Cal Arts was sort of the seed of this. When Cal Arts became so very important, 20, 30 years ago, that it created a generation of artists who stayed in Los Angeles. And as their careers grew, it helped germinate a much bigger collecting environment in Los Angeles.
Yeah, I do think it was a really interesting Cal Arts for sure. And then there was this one show at MoCA called Helter Skelter. I don't know if you remember it, but it was kind of at the time, a street art show. It had like Mike Kelly in it and Raymond Pettibone and all of these kind of artists that were living and working in LA that were probably not very well known outside of LA. That show really kind of changed the face of how artists were living and working kind of going forward. And I still look through the catalog, and it's really amazing. And Paul Schimmel did that show early on at MoCA. And I think that, that's really coming out of the Cal Arts School and then moving forward. But, even, Art Center and UCLA, and they really started, proliferating, great artists.
No, and with the broad show of Pacific Standard Time and Made in LA, there is a big emphasis today, at least, and it's been going on for a while, but on showing local artists in a serious and sustained way, so that there are these big shows focusing on the new talent in the area, on a recurring basis.
Yeah, the Hammer's been really great with that with Made in LA. They do it, I think, biannually, and it is really focused on kind of what's happening here. And I've often found, just from a personal level, when you see an artist that other artists are really supportive of, that's an artist to look at. Their eyes are better than ours sometimes, right?
An artist, as it were.
Yes.
So, Los Angeles also, for many years was a company town, and the entertainment industry still is, a dominant force in, I'm assuming, the economy, but also the culture of the city. And there were always people in the entertainment industry who were art collectors. Jacques Steinberg, I think is the name, who was a manager, and Vincent Price and Edward G. Robinson, up to Mike Ovitz. I mean, there are significant people from the entertainment industry. And Ovitz, in many ways, created a whole generation of people who sort of aspired to be like him and so became art collectors and all.
Michael is a wonderful collector. I mean, and, it's not only the quality of the collection, but he's so knowledgeable that it isn't a work or a great work by this artist. He really looks for the specific work for whatever reason it is that is important within his own collection. And so when you see it, it is really so impressive. And he did tell me this story once that's so funny. He said when he first started collecting, I think he bought like a Picasso or something like that. And he had all these people over and Picasso on the wall. And I guess like nobody cared. He was like, that's a Picasso. But I mean, that was many, many, many years ago. It's interesting you say that, because I just being from Los Angeles and leaving for, a good chunk of time and coming back, LA is traditionally, has been a one industry town for many, many years. And that's really what drove kind of so much, especially from the creative side, I would say, the creativity was coming out was really based on entertainment and film and, TV and these things. And it's really not so anymore. The landscape has really changed. And, as the city's grown culturally, it's also grown in that area too. We have, a lot of tech, we have a lot of finance, we have so many different industries. And it's not that the entertainment industry isn't one of the largest ones, but it's one of the largest ones. It isn't the only one, that really drives not only the wealth, but like what people are interested in out here. So I think that's also kind of seen a shift from our standpoint on collecting art and who your collector is, and the background that they have, and so what they may be interested in.
Well, I guess that's what I was asking. It sort of feels like what it took for Los Angeles to break out as an art center was it not to be a company town anymore. I mean, it's always nice that there's a certain, let's be honest, art collecting has a social competitive nature to it. There's always someone who wants to have as good or better an example of something as someone they consider a rival.
Well, without that, where would we be?
Exactly. But if it's a one company town, that somewhat limits the competition, and having a more varied economy. And it certainly feels like those things coincide. Certainly, Eli Broad, comes from real estate and then the insurance industries. Obviously, Getty is an important figure out there in terms of museums and all, and Norton Simon. So it's not like there haven't been other people in it, but sort of creating that critical mass where lots of people want to participate in this seems to have been one of those pieces.
Yeah, I think it is that. It is really the kind of range and depth of collectors, which has really grown so much over the last 20 years, I'd say. We've always had great collectors here, as you said, but it's the number and the amount of people who are interested and are collecting has really kind of exploded for the last. I mean, that's really why, I'm in the position that I'm in now, and why Christie's was so, behind opening up a building here and really making such a larger footprint. I mean, this is our largest office outside of New York, in the U.S., and it's such a big focus for us because of the number of interested people, who are buying and collecting and the collections that are sitting here.
So how does that work? Is the emphasis on using that space as a place to, now there's almost a standard tour of the major artworks, right? They go to Hong Kong, they go to London, they go to New York, they go to Los Angeles, they might go to Shanghai, there might be a few other places in there, but, Los Angeles is increasingly a necessary stop on the tour, but I assume that's only a small portion of it. Those are the big attention-getting ones, but you've got a big space and you do a fair amount of programming.
Yeah, we have a really big space, and it's a unique space within the company because it is a straight gallery space. We don't hold auctions here. We have the gallery is beautiful. I don't know if you've had a chance to see it, but you should come in. It was designed by Kulapot Sarazat of Y2. He worked for Tato Ando for many, many years, and it's really a special space. And the reason it was built was not only just to do these tours that you're talking about, which feed our auction calendar, but I think the need out here, particularly because our buyers and clients here are so different, in nature, which is very much why, I'm here, at Christie is there's such an importance on being part of the community, about having like a dialogue and a voice and, really kind of being part of the fabric and not being just a commercial entity, or service entity out there. And to that point, we built the gallery to do a lot of different things, partnerships, exhibitions, different engagement with the community, whether it's with our institutional partners or even just getting more people interested in art. There aren't that many centers of education out there. So if you're a new collector, if you're interested in something and you don't have access, you can, some people do, and, I certainly did this, just take yourself to the galleries and start seeing things, but sometimes you need a little help. And so, I think that was really the goal, the arts education as well. And, it's changed so much even after and through the pandemic. We had, a very good year last year. It was one of our biggest years in the last 10 years. And one of the major components of that was private sales. So we are an auction business, but, we did 1.7 billion in private sales last year, it is up over 100% from 2019, to give you an idea.
It's a huge number.
It's a big number. But I guess the idea is that, you have to understand that people who are now involved in the arts, who are buying, collecting, looking, interested all across different categories in 20th century, but even in the other categories, whether it's imps or American paintings or, other areas, they're looking for different ways of engaging, and we see that in the whole NFT space and these new digital spaces that have been proliferated over the last year or so. But maybe it isn't a straight auction. Maybe there's a comfort level with auction, with private sale, with exhibitions, with digital sales, all purely online sales. We haven't seen, we always thought that, you had to do a live auction. You don't. You really don't. It's really interesting how collectors have really, changed.
I do think that it has helped these last few years that people have a fair amount of price information, and there's enough sort of knowledge and comfort out there that it's easier to make a private sale when you hear a number and you think it's a reasonable one rather than having to guess. Is this a good deal or am I a sucker in this? And if you know that...
That's also something that's changed so much, is the amount of information out there. It used to be such as, like I said, when I started 20 years ago, there were 5 galleries in LA, and they were great ones, but there were very few. There's so much out there now, and everything's on the internet. You can really you can see a show in another city without actually seeing it, and there is something to be said for the experience of standing in front of a work or walking around it or whatever it is. But there's so much information out there that you can, and even from price databases and stuff, you can make a decision, like you said, based on a lot of different factors that weren't available to you, say, 10 years ago.
That brings up something very interesting that, all that has to be part of a conversation. And you mentioned earlier that you could go to, 20 years ago, you could go to a gallery opening and the artists would be there, the collectors would be there, sort of the community was there and visible. Certainly the last 2 years with the pandemic, a lot of that's been shut down. But even before that, it feels like, there's been a lot more art talk outside of what used to be traditional art spaces. And I guess what I'm asking is, what's the collecting culture like there? Where do people compare notes on either things that they've bought or interested in bought or want to, we know some of that is now taking place on Instagram. Instagram isn't really built for that, but it is sort of the way that people share things and see what, either their friends or peers or rivals are doing or what they want everyone else to know that they're doing.
Right.
But I assume that at dinner parties, people talk about, things that they're interested in all, but are there other places within, and maybe it's dinner parties and those sorts of social events, but I'm sort of curious, you have specialists and business getters out there. One part of their job is not just to stand in the office and wait for someone to talk to them about these things, but to go out and speak to people. So I'm curious where it happens in LA.
Well, I think in LA we are kind of back open. And it's been, I think we have the benefit of good weather and not a lot of closed spaces. And so we certainly had our tough times during the pandemic, but I think we fared much better than some places like perhaps New York, where it was very, very dark at times. And so, I do think that the groups are smaller, but people are still congregating together. And they really, I will say, we opened a show in the middle of I won't say in the middle of the pandemic, but it was kind of last spring, and we were kind of concerned if anybody was going to come or, whatever it was. And I just think people were so excited to stand in front of art again and have that dialogue. And the groups are smaller, but it's happening more often. And so I don't think that where the dialogue takes place has changed so much before, the institutions are kind of back up and running and doing their programming. So that's been really quite nice, and so there have been, the usual places, whether it's an opening or an institutional event or, even just, gatherings in people's homes, which is, really important. And that's an important point with Frieze coming up next week. It is a full schedule, and people have been very, very generous about doing collection visits for the different institutions and for Frieze, and so there's going to be a lot of gatherings, in-person gatherings and opportunities to kind of talk about what's out there.
So you just mentioned earlier that the private sales number is twice what it was a year or two ago, and certainly more than I think anyone a few years ago would have imagined private sales would be. What's the future for your office? Is it sort of expanding these different sort of categories? Is it, bringing other things into Los Angeles? I mean, you said you don't do live auctions, but, is there a reason you can't do auctions in LA?
No, I mean, I never like to predict the future because then it often doesn't go the way that it's supposed to or what I say.
It's always safest not to predict.
You never know. So, yeah, you never know. We may be doing auctions in LA in the future. We may be doing a lot of different things. But I think when I look at what's going on today, I think the general line of it or the kind of pull of it hasn't changed. I think it's really looking at our community and our collectors out here and finding what's interesting and how we can be additive and, how we can kind of, bring in something from maybe another area. The benefit we being a Christie's is that we're a global company. So we may be doing something super interesting in Asia and then want to try it out in LA or, vice versa or London. And so we can bring in things that are fresh and interesting that maybe nobody's doing here. And another thing that we really strive for is with these, we have an exhibition opening for Frieze, Cy Twombly, Bryce Martin, Stanley Whitney, and Louise Fishman, who is a kind of lesser known woman artist that was working at the same time as these artists. And so it's nice to throw in that wild card. Maybe people will know the first three names. They may not know the last name, but it really speaks to the work and it's, of the same generation. And maybe we can shed a little bit of light of what was happening, with some of the women in that area or different, kind of scenarios like that. And I think that can be very additive to the community here.
Are there other artists in LA who sort of are growing within the geographical area?
They are. And I wish I knew them all. It's funny. When I first started collecting, I got some very good advice from very, very good collectors here in LA who were kind of mentors. And one of the things they said was, collect in your generation, because that's who you're going to really understand the most. So what's happened as I've grown is that the art that I can really understand and speaks to me is, artists who are more in mid-career. So I love going to see the young artists and, seeing what's going on. But I have to be honest, like my eye isn't there because they're 20 years younger than me. And, with the NFTs and these things coming in, like I see it. I see how interesting it is. I see that it's something, but I think, it's harder for me to make that call that you're talking about now than if you had asked me 20 years ago. But they're certainly here. And I think the best place to really look for those are, having these conversations with people who are collecting young artists and are seeing everything. You have to see everything, just to understand, where it falls into context, and, talking to different artists and who they find interesting that's kind of up and coming, and the institutions and the curators, they really, really have a pulse on it and kind of can see it through an art history lens. So as a collector, those are your kind of go-tos.
So as a collector, when you work in you were a collector before you worked in the art industry.
Sure.
If I remember correctly, you were trained as a lawyer, and I'm assuming you worked as a lawyer before you actually started working in the art world.
I was a criminal prosecutor for the state of California. And when Kamala Harris was AG when I left, who is now our vice president. So that's quite nice.
So it's a well, some people would say it's not such a leap from one world
that's
to
true.
the other, but it is quite a leap from.
It's quite a leap. It was quite a leap. I think the art space for me was such a space of passion and such a big one, and the job was such a big one too. It was really hard to kind of juggled both, and this was so beautiful because I could really put together two of the most kind of driving forces of my time and my life, and it's been very successful, and it's been a very, very good fit, I think.
So does it change your experience as a collector? When you live above the shop, is it as important? I know you saw a lot of art, but you see a lot more art on a day-to-day basis than you did.
I do,
when you were...
but I will say it's different. It's different art. So, since we're a secondary, like auction is secondary business, and even private sales is secondary business, we don't represent artists primarily, obviously. And so by the time it comes to us, it's something that already has a market, and so it isn't what we're talking about, that young kind of emerging artist, and so it, the artists that I deal with or see more regularly on a regular basis, it's kind of shifted into a kind of an older category, I would say, or a more established category would be a better way to say it. And I do miss kind of really seeing the young things. And one day when I have more time, I will go back to that.
Do you collect less, I'm assuming, because...
The prices have shifted quite a bit in 20 years. And that's something we can go into a lot of depth about. But I do remember you could buy something wonderful and great from an artist that was so interesting and, kind of maybe 2 shows out of art school, a couple $1,000s, which is a lot of money still, but it's far more expensive now. I would say that. And so you have to be a little bit more cautious. I bought quite a bit in the beginning, whatever extra dollars we had went to art. But now I think because of where my eye is, I certainly buy bigger things and a little more thoughtfulness because the collection is somewhat established already. So I'm trying to see what fits in as opposed to just buying whatever I like. So it's a little bit different. I bought a couple of young artists, I bought Marley Freeman, who is a fine painter from New York, and let's see, what else have I gotten recently? I got, I'm trying to convince my friend Calvin to give me a painting. Calvin Marcus. I think he's wonderful. Excellent painter. But yeah, no, it shifted.
But you still collect the way you did before, just because of the prices and all, is maybe more of a considered, or because you have a lot of art, there are fewer places to acquire, but it's not fundamentally different from what you were doing, say, 10, 15 years ago.
No, that's exactly right. I just think that the dollar amounts are so different now. And these lovely collectors also, who kind of helped us out in the beginning, it also said, pick a number. And if it's below that number, and you like it, just buy it. But if it's above that number, then you have to kind of, do a little research and make sure that it's something that you want to be buying. And so, so you kind of have to stick within those parameters.
And in terms of clients, does that change the prices and all? Or, are new people coming in who are eager to spend more money? Or is it still, they need to get their feet under them and buy things that by emerging artists to get a feel for it? And then maybe they're aspirations and tastes get to a higher price point?
It depends. I think it really depends on who you are and what kind of person you are and where your comfort level is. I will say most of the clients that I deal with have very established collections already, and so they aren't starting from scratch. So it's a very different pace and a very different thing. Starting from scratch I can imagine, is quite daunting right now in this space, because there's just so much out there. Like I said, it was a much narrower world back then, which made it a little simpler in some ways. But what's, I think, nice about it is that in this space where there is so much out there, there's something for everybody. Something is going to speak to you. And in the end of the day, values aside, which, I'm not saying it's not important, but the greatest gift and benefit of being an art collector is living with it. It's the pleasure you get from living with it every day, walking past it, the memory that you have of, acquiring it, or, whatever stories that you have that kind of surround it. And so to have that gift of collecting for more people, because there is more out there and more that could speak to you, is really lovely.
I couldn't agree more. And I do think that, the value of art is a lot like real estate. People want to live in a home that's meaningful to them. They also don't want to lose money on it. Those aren't necessarily,
Maybe we'll have a rubber band effect in another 5 years, and we'll see everything going back to traditional. But you just don't know, I suppose, is my point. And the ride and the trends and the differences. I mean, that's really what makes it really interesting. And I think it's LA is certainly, I want to say, always kind of on the forefront of that, of what's new and what's happening. And
I feel like LA is the forefront. I mean, you can make arguments about everything, but I certainly, New York may still effectively act as the capital in terms of sales and something,
sure.
But it's certainly not. It's not the only place that the way it was before, or New York and London,
Yeah, I mean, I think those traditional centers are the establishment, but, what's pushing forward is everything that's out here, and you see it. Every major gallery is opening a space in LA, basically right now, as we speak. I mean, Hauser's been here for a while, but they're opening a second space. You have Pace coming in, you have a lot of the younger galleries coming in as well. And it really is because not only is so much of the art, being made here, and, they're looking for that, where it's going, just as we're speaking about that. But it's also to reach the new collectors that are really coming out of the West.
That is the perfect place to stop, Sonya. Thank you so much.
No, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us at the Artelligence Podcast, edited by Colin Ketchen, who also composed the original music. For more episodes, listen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, or wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to download the LiveArt app or visit us at liveart.io. Please join us for the next episode of the Artelligence Podcast. We're looking forward to it.